The night the blizzard hit Brookhaven, Ohio, the wind chill dropped to 38 below zero. Roads closed. Power lines snapped under the weight of ice. The whole town went dark one block at a time until the only thing moving on Maple Hollow Road was the snow itself falling sideways in sheets so thick you couldn't see your own hand if you held it out in front of you. And on that dead-end street, in a small two-bedroom house at the very end, a 72-year-old black grandmother named Mavis Holloway heard three heavy knocks on her front door. She wasn't expecting anyone. Nobody was expecting anyone. Not on a night like this. She set down her coffee cup, looked at the door, looked at the framed photograph of her late husband on the mantel, the one she'd been talking to all evening. And then slowly she rose from her recliner and walked toward the sound. What she saw when she opened that door would change everything. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand something. You need to know who Mavis Holloway really was. You need to know what she had lived through. You need to know why of all the people in Brookhaven who could have answered that door, she was the only one who would. Because every single thing in her life, every memory, every loss, every reason the world had ever given her to stay behind. Locked Doors was standing right there on her porch. Brookhaven, Ohio, population somewhere around 8,000 now, though the sign at the edge of town still read 12,000 from a census taken back before the plant closed. It used to mean something, Brookhaven. Back in the 70s and 80s, when the steel mill ran 3 shifts and the parking lot stayed full from sunup to sundown, it was the kind of place you could raise a family in and feel proud about it. Main Street had a movie theater, 2 diners, a soda fountain at Whitaker's drugstore. The Methodist church was packed every Sunday. The high school football games drew crowds that filled both sides of the bleachers, and on Friday nights in October you could hear the marching band all the way down to the river. That was Brookhaven once. By the time this story takes place, Brookhaven had lost nearly half its population. The mill had been gone for almost 30 years. The buildings that lined Main Street were mostly boarded up now with peeling paint and dusty windows and faded signs that still advertised businesses that hadn't existed in 2 decades. The movie theater was a thrift store. The drugstore was empty. The diners had closed one by one, the last of them. Della's Place shutting its doors in the spring of 2020 and never reopening. People drove through Brookhaven now. They didn't stop. And right in the middle of what was left on a quiet dead-end street called Maple Hollow Road lived Mavis Holloway. 72 years old, retired school cafeteria worker, widowed. Her husband Arnett had passed away in 2014. Complications from a factory injury he'd suffered back when the mill was still running. The plant had shut down long before he died, but the damage to his back, the years of pain, the slow decline, the medications that didn't quite work, all of it had finally caught up to him in a hospital room on a Tuesday morning in March. He'd been 66 years old. Mavis had been holding his hand when he went. She'd promised him in that hospital room, voice steady, even though her hands were shaking, that she'd be okay, that she'd keep going, that she wouldn't fall apart. She had kept that promise, mostly. She still lived in the same small 2-bedroom house Arnett had bought for them in 1979, the year they got married. He'd been 31 then and she'd been 26, and the house had cost them $18,000, and they'd thought they were the richest people in the world. He had built the back porch himself the summer after they moved in with his own hands and his own lumber and his own weekends. And she had brought him lemonade out there every afternoon while he worked, and they had sat on that finished porch every summer evening for 35 years afterward, watching the sun go down behind the maple trees. She had not changed one single thing about that porch since he died. Every morning Mavis was up by 5:15. Not because she had to be, not because there was anywhere she needed to go, just because that's who she was. That's who she had always been. She would make her coffee in the same percolator she'd had since 1989, the one with the cracked plastic handle she'd glued back together twice. She would feed the 2 stray cats who had shown up on her porch one rainy night about 7 years ago and never left. She had named them Bishop and Deacon after the men at her old church, and they came running every morning when they heard the screen door open, weaving around her ankles, while she poured kibble into the cracked ceramic bowl Arnett had bought her in Pigeon Forge back in 1994. Then she would sit at the kitchen table in the chair that faced the window, and she would open her devotional book, the one with the worn green cover, and she would read whatever passage was assigned for that day. She would underline things. She would whisper them out loud sometimes. And then she would look up at the photograph of Arnett on the mantel, the one taken at their 30th anniversary party at the VFW Hall, and she would say something to him. That morning, the morning of the storm, she had looked at his picture and said, "Storm's coming. Baby, big one this time. They're saying it might be the worst we've had in 20 years. She had taken a sip of coffee. You'd be telling me to make sure I had enough kerosene. I already checked. I'm okay. Now let me tell you about Mavis's situation because it matters. It matters for everything that comes next. She lived on a Social Security check, $1,143 a month. That was every dime she had coming in. There was no pension. The mill had gone bankrupt before Arnett's pension fully vested. There were no investments. There was no savings account beyond what she could put in the small tin can she kept on top of the kitchen cabinet, the one she only thought about when she was alone, the one nobody knew about, not even her neighbor, Darlene. Her roof had been leaking since the previous April. Not bad, not at first. But by August, it had gotten worse, and by October, it had gotten worse still. And now there were 3 plastic buckets lined up in the upstairs hallway, positioned underneath the brown water stains on the ceiling. Every time it rained, she went up and emptied them and put them back. Every time it snowed and then thawed, she did the same thing. She owed $2,200 on a medical bill from a fall she'd taken in October. She'd slipped on her own front steps on a frosty morning, going out to fetch the newspaper, and she'd come down hard on her right hip. She couldn't stand up. She'd lain there on the frozen concrete for almost 20 minutes before Darlene happened to look out her front window and see her. The ambulance had come. They'd taken her to the hospital. They'd given her x-rays and an MRI and pain medication, and they had let her go home that same afternoon. The bill had arrived 3 weeks later, and she had put it in the drawer with all the other bills she couldn't pay because looking at it made her chest feel tight in a way that scared her. Her furnace had broken in November. The repair estimate was $900, and she didn't have $900, and she wasn't going to have $900 anytime soon. So she had been heating the house with a kerosene space heater and the oven door cracked open on low running through the night. She wore 2 sweaters and a heavy quilt to bed most nights. She taped plastic sheeting over every window in the house to keep the drafts out. The tape was peeling in the kitchen, where the steam from cooking softened the adhesive, and she kept pressing it back down, kept telling herself she'd buy more tape next month. She didn't tell anyone. Not Darlene, not the Pritchard family down the street, not her doctor, not the woman at the Social Security office who called once a year to check on her. It wasn't denial, it was something deeper than that. Mavis believed truly all the way down to her bones that you make do with what you have. That complaining was a sin against the good things you still had, that the world owed you nothing and you owed the world whatever kindness you could spare. That was her code. That was her religion, really, more than anything they preached down at the Methodist church she used to attend before it merged with the parish 25 miles away, and she couldn't make the drive anymore in winter. But there was one thing she could not make peace with. One thing that sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't dissolve. In a small tin box on top of the kitchen cabinet, hidden behind the cookbooks, she never used anymore, Mavis Holloway kept $312 in folded bills, singles and fives mostly, a few tens, 120. She had been saving that money for 11 years. It was supposed to be for a headstone, because when Arnett had died in the spring of 2014, there had been no money for a proper headstone. The funeral itself had taken everything she had and then some. The cemetery had given them a temporary marker, a small wooden cross with his name and his dates painted on it in white letters that had now faded almost beyond reading. They told her she could replace it whenever she was ready. They said most people did within a year or two. 11 years had gone by. Every month when her Social Security check came in, Mavis would put aside whatever she could. Sometimes $5, sometimes $10, sometimes nothing when the bills were bad and the heat had to be paid. She had been adding to that tin box for over a decade, and she had $312, and a granite headstone cost almost $2,000. She was not going to make it. She knew that now in her bones, even though she wouldn't say it out loud. Even though she still added to the box every month. The math didn't work. She was 72, and she lived on a fixed income, and the world kept getting more expensive, and her husband's grave was still marked by a piece of wood. She had broken her promise to him. That was the thing she couldn't make peace with. Not the leaking roof, not the broken furnace, not the medical bills she'd never pay off. Those were just life. Those were just what happened when the world stopped caring about places like Brookhaven. But Arnett had built her a home with his own hands. He had loved her for 35 years. He had held her hand when his own daughter died at 16 months from a fever they couldn't bring down, and he had held her hand again 20 years later when her mama passed, and he had never once raised his voice to her in all those years together. And she could not give him a proper stone to mark where he lay. That was the shame she carried, the one she never spoke about, the one that lived in the tin box on top of the kitchen cabinet behind the cookbooks she never used. She would never have called it a shame. She would have said she was working on it. She would have said the Lord would provide. But late at night when the house was quiet and the kerosene heater was the only sound, she would sometimes climb up on a chair and pull down that tin box, and she would count the bills slowly one at a time, and she would whisper, "I'm trying, baby. I'm still trying." Now here is what you need to understand about Mavis Holloway, and this is the part that matters most. Despite everything I just told you, the leaking roof and the medical bills and the broken furnace and the tin box that wasn't filling up fast enough, despite all of it, Mavis Holloway gave. She gave constantly. She watched the Pritchard children after school 3 days a week so their mother could pick up second shifts at the warehouse out by the highway. She did not charge a dime. She made them peanut butter sandwiches and helped them with their homework and told them stories about Brookhaven the way it used to be, and when their mother came to pick them up at 7 in the evening, Mavis would slip her a Tupperware container of whatever she'd made for dinner that night, even when she barely had enough for herself. She left foil-wrapped plates of food on porches when she knew someone was going through it. The Hendricks family when their oldest got sick, the widow Cookson when her sister died, the young man at the end of the block whose wife had left him in November and who hadn't been seen outside in 2 weeks. Mavis didn't knock. She didn't wait for a thank you. She just left the plate, walked home, and kept walking. The summer before, when the city had stopped sending crews to clean up Maple Hollow Road because of budget cuts, Mavis had organized the only neighborhood cleanup the street had seen in years. She had printed flyers at the library using a stamp she carried in her purse because the librarian let her print for free if she brought her own paper. 6 people had shown up. She had thanked every single one of them like they had handed her $1 million. That was Mavis Holloway. Invisible to the town council, invisible to the system, forgotten by the church she had attended for 40 years. She did not have a cell phone with a data plan. She did not have the internet. She had a landline, a small radio she kept on the kitchen counter, and a television with 3 channels that came in clear when the weather was good. But she had something most people in Brookhaven didn't have anymore. She had a kind of grace that didn't ask for anything back. She had a way of looking at people that made them feel seen. She had a code she lived by, and she had lived by it for so long that it was no longer a code. It was just her. She had told the Pritchard children once while they were eating peanut butter sandwiches at her kitchen table, "You don't have to have a lot to give a lot." She had meant every word. She had no idea how soon those words were going to be tested. Now here is something else you need to know about Mavis Holloway. And this is the part that almost nobody in Brookhaven knew. Not even Arnett had known the full story, though he had known pieces. When Mavis was 12 years old in the summer of 1965, her family lived in Mobile, Alabama. Her daddy worked at the shipyard. Her mama took in laundry. They had a small house on a dirt road on the colored side of town, and they had 2 children, a boy and a girl. The boy was Ezekiel. The girl was Mavis. Everybody called him Zeke. Zeke was 17 that summer, tall, lean, with a laugh you could hear from 3 houses down. He worked alongside their daddy at the shipyard during the week and ran around with his friends on the weekends, and he was saving up for a used Chevy he'd seen advertised in the paper. He had plans. He was going to take Mavis for a ride in that Chevy the day he bought it. He had promised her. On a Saturday evening in June 1965, Zeke was walking home from a baseball game with 2 of his friends. They passed a gas station on Government Street. There was a white woman at the pump filling up her car, and somebody nobody ever knew who said something. Or maybe nobody said anything at all. The white woman went inside the gas station, and the white men who were inside came back out, and Zeke and his friends were still walking down the sidewalk, just walking, not even close to the pump anymore. The men came after them in a pickup truck. Zeke's friends got away. They ran in different directions, scattered across yards and through alleys, and they got home alive. Zeke didn't. He made it almost all the way back to the dirt road where his family lived. He was bleeding by then, his shirt torn, his face already beginning to swell. He saw the porch light of his own house. He started running. Mavis was at the front window. She was 12 years old, and she was waiting for her brother to come home so they could play a game of cards before bed. And she saw him stumble into the yard, and she saw the pickup truck pull up behind him. She saw what happened next. She would never speak about it. Not in detail, not for the rest of her life. She told Arnett years later that her brother had died in 1965 and that white men had killed him, and Arnett had held her and said nothing because there was nothing to say. She had told him that was all she could ever tell him. He had nodded. He had never asked her again. There was no investigation. The sheriff came out the next morning, took a statement from her daddy, and never came back. The men were known in town. Everybody knew who they were. Nothing happened. Zeke was buried that Wednesday in a small plot at the colored cemetery on the edge of Mobile, and his name was painted on a wooden cross because there was no money for a stone, and within a year the family had moved to Ohio because her daddy couldn't bear to live in that town anymore. Mavis Holloway was 12 years old when she learned that the world would let a black boy die in the dirt and never say his name again. She was 72 years old now. She had carried that for 60 years. She had never once spoken her brother's name out loud in the state of Ohio. Not to Arnett, not to her neighbors, not to anyone. Zeke existed only in a single black and white photograph she kept tucked between the pages of her Bible, the one her mama had given her the year she was confirmed. The photograph showed a 17-year-old boy in a baseball uniform smiling at the camera, his cap pushed back on his head. That was her brother. That was the thing she had buried so deep that even she could go weeks without thinking about him. And that more than anything else was why what happened that night on her porch was a miracle. Because the men standing on her porch in the snow looked at first glance like the men who had killed her brother. Now, the afternoon of February 14th, the sky over Brookhaven went dark at 3 in the afternoon. It wasn't cloudy, it was dark. The way it gets dark in a tornado or in an eclipse or in the moment before something terrible. The radio said the interstate had already closed in both directions. Blizzard warning through the night. Wind chill expected to drop below -20 by sundown, lower than that before midnight. They were saying it could be the worst storm Brookhaven had seen since the blizzard of 1978. Mavis moved through the house with quiet purpose. She filled every pot and pan she owned with water, lining them up on the kitchen counter just in case the pipes froze. She checked the kerosene level in the heater. There was enough maybe if she was careful. She stacked extra blankets on the couch in the living room. She set 2 flashlights on the kitchen table with fresh batteries beside them. She lit 2 candles, one for the kitchen window and one for the mantel next to Arnett's photograph. And then she did something small, something she could not explain later even to herself. She walked down the hallway to the closet, the one she had not opened in over a year, and she pulled out Arnett's old hunting coat. Brown canvas wool lined heavy as a winter blanket. It still smelled like him, even after all these years, like cedar and motor oil and the faint trace of the tobacco he used to chew on the porch in the evenings. She carried the coat back to the living room and laid it across the arm of the couch. "Just in case somebody needs it," she whispered. She did not know why she said it. She did not know why she had pulled out the coat. There was no one coming. There was nobody to need it. The roads were closed. The town was hiding from the storm. She would understand by morning. By 7 o'clock, Brookhaven was buried. The snow came down so thick you couldn't see the house across the street. The wind screamed through the bare branches of the maple trees on Maple Hollow Road, the trees the street had been named after, and the old wood of Mavis's house creaked and groaned against the gusts like it was trying to hold itself together. And then the power went out. The whole east side of Brookhaven dark in an instant. No street lights, no porch lights, no hum from refrigerators, no glow from television sets behind drawn curtains. Nothing. Just the snow falling and the wind screaming and the candle in Mavis's kitchen window flickering against the glass. She turned the kerosene heater up as high as it would go. She pulled the quilt off the back of the recliner and wrapped it around her shoulders, and she sat down in Arnett's old chair, the one she still thought of as his, even though he had been gone 11 years, and she listened to the storm. The temperature outside was 22 below zero. The wind chill was pushing it past -38. It was going to be a long night. But 5 miles north of Brookhaven on Highway 16, 5 men were fighting for their lives. They were Hell's Angels, a chapter out of upstate New York. 5 riders on 5 Harleys heading south for what they called a memorial ride. They were honoring a fallen brother, a man named Rusty, who had ridden with them for 26 years before cancer took him the previous spring. Every year since they had made this ride. Same route, same weekend. It was sacred to them the way certain things are sacred to men who don't have many sacred things left. The leader of the group was a big man, 56 years old, silver beard, broad shoulders, wraparound glasses, hands the size of catcher's mitts. He carried himself like a man who had been carrying himself like that for a very long time. His name was Sutton. Behind him rode Brock, the youngest of the group, mid-20s, still new to the chapter. Knox, who had a 5-year-old daughter back home and a tattoo of her name on the inside of his forearm. Wyatt, who never said much, but who would lay down his life for any man riding beside him. And Hollis, the road captain, who knew every highway in 3 states by heart. 5 men, 5 machines, miles of empty road. The storm came in faster than anyone had predicted. The forecast had said snow after midnight light, at first accumulating overnight. But by 6:30 in the evening, visibility was already down to nothing. The road had turned into a sheet of black ice. The temperature was plummeting. The wind was strong enough that the bikes were drifting sideways even at low speed. Sutton went down first. His front tire caught a patch of ice, and his Harley slid sideways with the awful slow inevitability of 800 pounds of metal losing traction on a frozen highway. He went down hard, rolled twice, lost his glasses in the snow. He got up slow. He waved off the others when they tried to help. Two of the bikes wouldn't restart in the cold. The engines flooded. The batteries drained. Brock had caught road rash through his jacket when he laid his bike down trying to avoid Sutton. A deep gash ran from the inside of his elbow down to his wrist, blood already soaking through the leather. His arm was going numb. He couldn't feel his fingers. They were stranded. No cell signal. The towers were already down from the ice. The GPS on Sutton's phone showed one town nearby, Brookhaven, 4.8 miles south. At BAM. Sutton made the call. "We walk," he said. "Push what we can, leave the rest." They buried 3 of the bikes in snowdrifts on the shoulder of the highway, marked the spot with a piece of red bandana tied to a tree branch, and started south. 2 of them pushed the bikes that could still be pushed. The wind hit them broadside, cutting through the leather like it wasn't there. 5 men in motorcycle jackets and boots walking through a blizzard in the dark. Let me be honest with you for a moment. Hypothermia in conditions like that sets in fast. 30 minutes for exposed skin. These men were wet. Brock was bleeding. Knox's beard was already encased in ice. Wyatt's feet were going numb inside boots that were never designed for 2 feet of snow. Sutton kept them moving. He walked at the front. He turned around every 30 seconds and counted heads. "Nobody sits down," he kept saying. His voice was hoarse from the cold. "Nobody stops. You stop, you die." It took them almost 2 hours to reach the edge of Maple Hollow Road. By the time they got there, every man among them was past the point of feeling cold. They were in that other place, the one that comes after cold, where the body has stopped trying to keep itself warm because it has used up everything it has. Every house was dark, either empty or locked up tight. People hiding from the storm behind closed doors and drawn curtains. They knocked on the first house. No answer. Knocked on the second. A curtain moved in an upstairs window and then nothing. Hollis cursed under his breath. Brock was shaking so badly he could barely stand. Wyatt's feet were going white at the toes, the kind of white that means tissue is starting to die. They were running out of time, and then Sutton saw it. At the very end of the block, at the end of the dead-end street, in the very last house before the road dissolved into a field of snow, there was a small flickering light. A single candle in a front window. The only light on the entire street. Mavis Holloway's house. Sutton walked up the porch steps. His boots were caked in 2 inches of ice. Every joint in his body was screaming. He had not been this cold in 56 years of life, and he had been a lot of cold places. He knocked. 3 heavy knocks. The old wooden screen door rattled in its frame. Inside, Mavis heard it. She froze in her chair. She set down her coffee cup very slowly on the small table beside the recliner. She looked at the front door. She looked at the photograph of Arnett on the mantel. She looked at the candle in the window flickering. She got up. She walked to the kitchen, picked up the flashlight, and walked back through the living room. She put her hand on the doorknob and she stopped, and she did something she had not done in years. She pulled back the corner of the curtain on the front window and looked out. What she saw made her stop breathing. 5 men, 5 enormous men standing on her porch in the snow in leather jackets with Hell's Angels patches on the backs. Bearded, tattooed, snow-caked on every surface of their bodies. One of them, the youngest looking, was bleeding through his sleeve. 5 white bikers on a black grandmother's porch in the middle of the night. And then it happened. Mavis had not thought about that summer night in Mobile, Alabama in a long time. Months, maybe years. She had buried it so deep that most days she could go from morning until night without it surfacing. But it surfaced now. The smell of the dirt road in June. The sound of her brother's footsteps on the porch as he stumbled toward the door. The headlights of the pickup truck behind him. The shape of the men climbing down from the truck bed. Her mother's scream. Her father in the kitchen, frozen, his hands still on the radio dial. Her brother's eyes when he looked up at the window where she was watching. Zeke. She could not breathe. She let the curtain fall. She stepped back from the window. Her hand was shaking so badly the flashlight beam jumped across the ceiling. She reached for the telephone on the side table. She picked up the receiver. The dial tone hummed in her ear. Her finger hovered over the 9. Her whole body was telling her to call. 12-year-old Mavis was telling her to call. But 72-year-old Mavis turned her head, and through the cracked open curtain, she saw something else. She saw the youngest one, the one who was bleeding. He had taken off his glove. He was holding his bare hand against his arm where the blood was coming through the leather. His face was lit by the candle in the window. He looked up, and for just 1 second his eyes met hers through the glass. He looked exactly like Zeke had looked the moment before the men got to him. Scared, young, trying so hard not to show it. Mavis set the phone down. She stood there in the dark hallway with her hand still on the receiver, and she felt something move inside her chest. Not a thought. Something older than a thought. Something that came from a place she had built 50 years ago, when she had decided in a way she could not have explained even to herself that she was not going to live the rest of her life waiting for white men on her porch to be the men who had killed her brother. She had decided that a long time ago. She just hadn't had to test it until now. She turned. She walked to the mantel. She looked at the photograph of Arnett, the one taken at their 30th anniversary party at the VFW hall, the one where he was laughing at something somebody had said off camera. "What would you do, baby?" she whispered. She already knew the answer. She walked back to the front door. She drew in a breath. She turned the deadbolt. She put her hand on the knob. She opened the door. The cold hit her face like a slap. The 5 men on her porch turned toward her, all of them at once, and the snow blew sideways into her hallway, and for 1 second nobody spoke. Then the big one in the front, the one with the silver beard, the one whose name was Sutton, the one who would change her life in ways she could not yet imagine, looked at her with eyes that were almost frozen shut. His voice came out as a whisper. "Ma'am, I'm real sorry to bother you. We got caught out in the storm. One of my guys is hurt. We just need to get out of the cold." The wind howled behind them. Mavis looked at his face, then at the bleeding young man behind him, the one whose eyes had reminded her of Zeke, then back at Sutton. She opened the door wider. "Well, get in here," she said, "before you freeze to death, all of you." And 5 Hells Angels filed past a 72-year-old black grandmother into a small house on a dead-end street in a forgotten town in Ohio on the coldest night of the year, while behind them the storm screamed across the empty field, and the candle in the window flickered once, then steadied, then burned on. 5 men filed through Mavis Holloway's front door one by one, and they filled her small living room completely. Shoulders brushing the walls, heads nearly grazing the low ceiling. Snow melted off their boots onto the linoleum in puddles that spread outward and joined together until the whole entryway was wet. The room smelled like frozen leather and wet wool, and the kind of cold that gets into the threads of a man's clothes and doesn't come out for hours. Mavis closed the door behind them. She turned the deadbolt. She did not look back at the photograph on the mantel. She looked at the 5 men standing in her living room, and she looked at them the way a woman looks at a problem she has already decided to solve. "Sit down wherever you can," she said. Her voice was calm. Her hands were steady. "Somebody get that boy to my kitchen table, the one bleeding, right now." Wyatt guided Brock by his good arm, the one that wasn't soaked through with blood, and walked him through the narrow doorway into the kitchen. Brock's legs were shaking. His teeth were chattering so hard you could hear it across the room. He sank down into the wooden chair at the kitchen table, the chair Arnett used to sit in for breakfast every morning for 35 years, and he put his bleeding arm flat on the tabletop, and he stared down at it like he wasn't sure whose arm it was. Mavis went straight to the bathroom. She came back with Arnett's old first aid kit from under the sink, a white metal box with a red cross painted on the front. She had kept that box stocked for 11 years. She did not know why. She had refilled the peroxide bottle and replaced the gauze and checked the expiration dates on the bandages, and she had done all of it for 11 years without ever once needing to use any of it. Just in case. That was what she had told herself. Just in case. She set the box on the kitchen table next to Brock's bleeding arm. She pulled out a wooden chair. She sat down across from him. She took his arm in her hands gently, the way she had taken Arnett's hand at the hospital all those years ago. "Hold still, baby," she said. "I've patched up worse." She rolled back the torn sleeve of his leather jacket. The cut was ugly. Deep at the elbow, ragged all the way down to the wrist. Road rash, the kind that comes from skin sliding across frozen asphalt at speed. There was gravel in it. There was blood dried and fresh mixed together. The skin around the edges of the cut was beginning to turn a color that meant the cold had gotten in. Brock hissed through his teeth when she touched the peroxide to it. She did not apologize. She did not rush. She just worked. She cleaned the wound with steady hands. She picked out the gravel with a pair of tweezers from the kit. She dabbed at the blood with a clean cloth and threw the cloth into a pile and reached for another one and kept going. She tore strips from a clean bedsheet she had pulled out of the linen closet on her way back from the bathroom, didn't even think twice about it, just tore the sheet right down the middle, and she wrapped his arm tight. Neat. Careful. Like she had done this 1,000 times. When she was done, she patted his hand once and stood up. "There," she said. "That'll hold till you see a real doctor." Brock looked up at her. His mouth opened. He couldn't quite get a sound out. Then he said very quietly, "Thank you, ma'am." She nodded once and turned toward the stove. There was a pot of chicken soup on it. She had made it that afternoon before the storm got bad enough for maybe 2 servings. Her dinner that night and her lunch the next day. She looked at the pot. She looked at the 5 men in her living room and her kitchen men who were the size of refrigerators. Men who had not eaten in hours, men whose bodies were trying to warm themselves from the inside out and burning calories like they were on fire. She did the math in her head. Then she added water to the pot. She opened a can of kidney beans from the back of the pantry, the one she had been saving for a casserole she was going to make for the Pritchard kids next week, and she poured it in. She added a cup of dry rice. She added the last of the carrots from the bottom drawer of the refrigerator sliced thin so they would cook fast. She added more salt, more pepper, a pinch of the dried thyme Arnett used to grow in pots on the back porch. She stirred it all together. She turned the flame up. She pulled a sleeve of saltine crackers from the cabinet, half a loaf of white bread from the bread box, and a jar of pickles she had canned herself the previous summer. She set them all out on the kitchen counter. When the soup was ready, she served them first. Every one of them. 5 bowls of soup ladled steaming hot with crackers on the side, and bread torn into pieces and pickles in a small dish in the middle of the table. She did not make a bowl for herself. Sutton noticed. He had been standing in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen, watching all of this happen silent the way a man watches something he is trying to understand. He had taken off his soaked gloves. He was rubbing his hands together to bring the feeling back. When Mavis turned away from the stove, he caught her eye. "Ma'am," he said, "aren't you going to eat?" "I had a big lunch," she said. She hadn't. He looked at her for a moment longer. He didn't say anything. He sat down at the kitchen table with the others, and he ate the soup she had made. And he ate it slowly the way a man eats food he knows somebody else needed. These men were soaked through. They were shivering down to their bones. Brock's lips had a blue tint to them. Knox's beard was still encased in ice that was now melting and dripping onto the front of his vest. Wyatt had taken off his boots at the door, and his feet had gone the color of paper. Mavis moved through the house, pulling every warm thing she could find. Both quilts off her bed, the wool blanket from the hallway closet, the crocheted Afghan her mother had made for her in 1968, the one that had been on the back of the couch in every house Mavis had ever lived in, the one that smelled faintly of the cedar chest where it spent the summers. She brought them all out and laid them across the laps of 5 strangers. Then she went to the couch and she picked up Arnett's old hunting coat, the one she had laid out that afternoon without knowing why. She walked over to Sutton. He was the biggest, the coldest probably because he had been at the front of the walk and had taken the wind for the others. He was standing by the wall now because there wasn't anywhere left to sit, holding his bowl of soup, his hands still trembling slightly from the cold. She held out the coat. "Put this on," she said. "It was my husband's." Sutton looked at her. He looked at the coat. Something passed across his face, an emotion he was not used to showing. He took the coat from her. He set down the soup. He put the coat on. It fit him almost perfectly. He did not say thank you out loud right away. He couldn't. He just stood there for a second with one hand on the lapel of the coat, his fingers brushing the worn canvas. And then he met her eyes and said very quietly, "I appreciate it, ma'am. More than I can say." She nodded. She turned to Wyatt. His feet, the white ones, early frostbite, the kind that can take toes if you don't get it warm fast enough. She knelt down on the kitchen floor, a 72-year-old woman kneeling on cold linoleum in front of a man she had never met. She took Wyatt's bare feet between her palms. She rubbed them slow and firm, working the blood back into them the way her mama had taught her to do for her daddy when he came home from the shipyard in the winter and his feet had gone numb in his boots. Wyatt stared at her. He didn't say a word. His eyes were red and not from the cold. She rubbed his feet until the color started coming back. Then she pulled off her own wool socks, the ones she was wearing, the thick gray ones Arnett had bought her at the Tractor Supply in Mansfield back in 2009, and she pulled them onto Wyatt's feet. "Those are my good socks," she said. "Don't you go running off with them." Wyatt let out a sound, not quite a laugh, half something else. It was the first time any of the 5 men had made a sound that wasn't a word of need or pain since they had walked through her door. Mavis stood up. Her knees popped. She braced one hand on the table to steady herself. She did not sit down. She went to the kerosene heater and turned it up another notch. While all this was happening, Sutton was watching. He did not say much. He just watched. He sat in the wooden chair Mavis had given him with Arnett's hunting coat wrapped around his shoulders, and he took in the room. He noticed the 3 plastic buckets in the upstairs hallway visible from where he was sitting lined up under brown water stains on the ceiling. He noticed the plastic sheeting taped over every window peeling at the corners where the steam from the kitchen had loosened the adhesive. He noticed that there was no furnace running, just the kerosene heater in the corner doing the work of a heating system in a house in Ohio in February. He noticed the framed photographs on the walls, Mavis and Arnett on their wedding day in 1979, both of them younger than any of his children were now. A group shot from the school cafeteria where she had worked for 28 years, Mavis in a hairnet in the middle of the back row surrounded by other women in aprons, all of them smiling. A grainy photograph of an older black couple Sutton assumed were her parents. He noticed one more photograph, smaller than the others, on the mantel almost hidden behind the larger frame of Arnett. It was a picture of a grave, a small plot at the edge of a cemetery with a wooden cross in the ground instead of a stone. The name on the cross was just barely visible. The dates underneath were too small to read from where he was sitting. He looked at that photograph for a long time. He did not ask. He noticed also the magazine under the kitchen table. Old, dog-eared, being used to prop up a wobbly table leg. The cover was facing him, but the angle was wrong, and the corner was bent, and he could only see part of a face and a partial headline in bold letters. He didn't think about it. Not yet. What he thought about was the woman herself. Mavis hung the men's vest near the kerosene heater to dry. She draped each one carefully over a kitchen chair she had pulled into the living room for that purpose. As she draped Sutton's vest over the chair back, she noticed the patches. The big one on the back, the death's head, the words Hell's Angels arched above and below it. She knew what that was. Everybody knew. She had seen it on television. She had seen it on the news. But below it, smaller, harder to see in the dim candlelight, there was another patch. A letter that looked like an R inside the shape of some kind of crest. It didn't look like a biker patch. It looked like something else. A company. A logo. She didn't think about it. She hung the vest. She moved on. By 11 o'clock that night, the men had eaten. Their cheeks had color in them again. Brock's arm had stopped bleeding through the bandage. Wyatt could feel his toes. Knox had managed to thaw the ice out of his beard in the kitchen sink. They sat in the living room, scattered across every available surface, wrapped in Mavis's quilts and her mother's Afghan, and they talked. That was the part nobody could have predicted. They talked. Knox showed her a photograph on his phone. His daughter, 5 years old, blonde curls, missing a front tooth, grinning like she had just won something. He carried the phone everywhere, even when there was no signal, he said, just so he could look at her face. Brock talked about his mother. She lived alone in a small house outside of Scranton, Pennsylvania, in a neighborhood not unlike this one. He called her every Sunday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She made him a list of things she wanted to tell him during the week so she wouldn't forget anything when he called. He hadn't seen her in 2 months. He was supposed to visit her next month. Hollis didn't say much. He just sat by the heater and let it work on him. But at one point, he looked up at Mavis and said, "Ma'am, I haven't been this warm in 8 hours. I want you to know that." She nodded. She was sitting in Arnett's recliner now, finally, after making sure everyone else had a place. She had a blanket over her own lap. She was sipping a cup of weak coffee she had made for herself once everyone else had been served. Sutton was sitting on the couch directly across from her. He had not eaten much. He had finished half his soup and set the bowl down. He had been watching her off and on for the better part of an hour. He said, "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" She nodded. "How long has the roof been leaking?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. Then she said, "A while." He nodded slowly. He didn't push. After a minute, he said, "I lost my wife in 2021. Mavis looked at him. "Vivian," he said. "Breast cancer. We were married 31 years. The room got quiet. The other men got very still. Mavis set her coffee cup down on the side table. "How old was she asked. 53, Sutton said. "She was diagnosed at 50. We had 3 good years after the first treatment. Then it came back, and then it didn't go away." Mavis nodded. She didn't say she was sorry. She knew the way only people who had carried loss for a long time knew that "I'm sorry" was not what he needed. "My husband passed in 2014, she said. "Arnett, he was 66. His back finally gave out. The mill had been gone almost 20 years by then, but the damage was already done." Sutton nodded. "You don't get over it," Mavis said. "No," Sutton said. "You learn to carry it." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's right," she said. Something passed between them in that moment. Two people who had each lost the person who made the world make sense, sitting in a small living room in a forgotten town in Ohio, while a blizzard screamed outside, and the only light was a kerosene heater and a single candle on the mantel. Sutton said very quietly, "The first year I tried to figure out how to keep going. The second year I figured out that I wasn't going to figure it out. I was just going to keep going anyway." Mavis closed her eyes for a second. She nodded. "That's about right," she said. She picked up her coffee cup again. She took a sip. She did not look at Arnett's photograph on the mantel because she didn't need to. He was in the room with her. He had been in the room with her since the first knock on the door. It was after midnight when it happened. Knox got up to stretch. He was a big man, and he had been sitting in one position for too long, and he reached up to the bookshelf above the couch to steady himself as he stood, and his hand brushed the spine of an old leather book. It fell. It hit the edge of the coffee table. It bounced. It landed on the floor with a soft thump, splayed open pages down. "Oh, ma'am, I'm sorry," Knox said. He bent down to pick it up. It was Mavis's Bible, the one her mother had given her the year she was confirmed, the one with the cracked black leather cover and the gold lettering nearly worn off the spine. The one she kept on the bookshelf above the couch and read from every morning at the kitchen table. When Knox picked it up, something fluttered out of the pages. A photograph, small, black and white, old. It landed face up on the rug between the coffee table and the couch. Sutton was the closest to it. He reached down without thinking. He picked it up. He looked at it. A young man, 17 years old maybe, in a baseball uniform, his cap pushed back on his head, smiling at the camera with the easy grin of a boy who thinks he's got all the time in the world. Sutton went very still. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He turned it over. There was writing on the back, faded pencil, just 2 words and a year. Zeke, 1965. Sutton looked up. Mavis was watching him from the recliner. Her hands had gone very still in her lap. Her coffee cup was halfway to her mouth, frozen there. "Ma'am," Sutton said. His voice was quiet. "Who is this?" She didn't answer. The other 4 men had gone quiet. They didn't know what was happening, but they could feel that something was happening. The room had changed. The air had changed. Sutton held out the photograph toward her. "Ma'am," he said again. "Who is this?" Mavis set her coffee cup down on the side table. Her hand was shaking just barely. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the face she had not looked at in front of another human being in 60 years. Her brother. She had not said his name out loud in the state of Ohio in 6 decades. "His name was Ezekiel," she said. Her voice was so quiet the men in the back of the room had to lean forward to hear her. "Everybody called him Zeke. He was my brother. He was 17 years old. He was killed in 1965 in Mobile, Alabama." She took a breath. "White men killed him." The room did not move. Sutton was holding the photograph in both hands now, like he was afraid he might drop it. His face had gone pale. Not the pale of the cold which had left him hours ago, a different pale. "Mobile," he said, "in 1965. Mavis looked at him. "Yes," she said. He set the photograph down on the coffee table very carefully, like it was made of glass. He put his face in his hands for a moment. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. He was a 56-year-old man with a silver beard and tattoos up his neck and hands like catcher's mitts, and his eyes were wet. "Ma'am," he said, "I need to tell you something." Mavis waited. "My mother," Sutton said, "was a journalist." Mavis tilted her head just slightly. "Her name was Eleanor Ravenel," Sutton said. "She wrote for the Birmingham Sentinel in the 1960s. She covered the civil rights beat even though they didn't want a woman covering it. She fought to get on that beat. They gave it to her because nobody else wanted it." He took a breath. "In the summer of 1965, my mother wrote a series of articles about young black men who had been killed across the South. Boys who had been killed and whose deaths nobody investigated. Boys whose names disappeared. She drove all over Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia that summer, interviewing the families. She wrote 10 articles. She turned them in. The paper refused to publish them. They said it would inflame the community. They said it would lose them subscribers." He paused. "She wouldn't drop it. She kept pushing. They fired her in October of 1965. He looked at the photograph on the coffee table. "She kept those articles, every single one of them. She had a manila folder in her file cabinet that she carried with her every time we moved. She would not throw it away. She would not let anybody else throw it away. When I was a boy, she would sit me down sometimes and she would say, 'Sutton, there are debts in this country that have never been paid. And the people who owe them mostly don't know they owe them. But somebody has to remember.'" He looked up at Mavis. One of those articles was about a 17-year-old boy in Mobile, Alabama, who was killed by a group of white men in a pickup truck in June of 1965. He had been walking home from a baseball game. The sheriff never investigated. My mother interviewed the family. She wrote down the boy's name. He took a slow breath. "His name was Ezekiel Holloway." Mavis closed her eyes. She did not make a sound. She did not move. She just closed her eyes, and the tears that had been trapped in her chest for 60 years started to come slowly, one at a time, sliding down her cheeks and falling onto the blanket in her lap. Sutton sat very still on the couch across from her. The other 4 men had not made a sound. Knox had sat back down on the floor. Brock was holding his bandaged arm against his chest. Wyatt was looking at the floor. Hollis had his hand over his mouth. After a long time, Mavis opened her eyes. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "My mom and my daddy moved us up here to Ohio in 1966, she said. "My daddy couldn't bear to live in Mobile anymore. We had family in Cleveland. We came up. He got work in a foundry. I met Arnett in 1974 at a church picnic in Brookhaven. We married in 1979. I never went back to Mobile. I never spoke my brother's name out loud after we left. Not to Arnett, not to anybody. He died and the world forgot him, and I let the world forget him because I didn't know what else to do." She looked at Sutton. "You're telling me your mother remembered him?" "Yes, ma'am," Sutton said. "She remembered him, and she made sure I would remember him too." Mavis nodded slowly. She did not say anything for a long time. The kerosene heater hummed. The candle on the mantel flickered. The wind outside had died down just a little, the storm beginning to wear itself out the way storms always do. Eventually, even the worst of them. Mavis looked at the photograph of Zeke on the coffee table. "He was going to buy a Chevy," she said. Her voice was steadier now. "He had a job at the shipyard with my daddy. He was saving up. He was going to take me for a ride in it the day he bought it. He had promised me." She took a breath. "He never got the Chevy." Sutton nodded. "He had a laugh you could hear from 3 houses down," Mavis said. "He used to put his hand on the top of my head when we walked anywhere together. He used to say I was the smartest girl he knew." She looked at Sutton. "Nobody has said his name out loud in front of me in 60 years. Not even Arnett, who knew. He knew it hurt me, and he didn't want to make it hurt more, and so he never said it. I never asked him to say it." She let the silence sit a moment. "And tonight, in the middle of a blizzard, 5 strangers walk into my house, and one of them is the son of the woman who tried to tell my brother's story when nobody else would." Sutton couldn't speak. Mavis sat for a long time in Arnett's recliner. She looked at the photograph on the coffee table. She looked at Arnett's photograph on the mantel. She looked at the 5 men in her living room. She said very quietly, "I think the Lord moves in ways we don't understand." Sutton nodded. "I think he does." At 3 in the morning, Mavis stood up from the recliner. The men were asleep. All of them. Brock was stretched out on the couch with the Afghan over him. Knox was on the floor next to the couch head, propped on his folded leather jacket. Wyatt was curled up in the armchair in the corner with both quilts wrapped around him. Hollis was on the floor by the heater. Sutton was sitting in the wooden chair from the kitchen, head leaned back against the wall, eyes closed. Mavis walked quietly to the kitchen. She turned on the small light over the stove. She pulled out her flour canister. She pulled out the sugar. She pulled out the buttermilk from the refrigerator and the lard from the pantry and her mama's old metal biscuit cutter from the drawer beside the sink. She made biscuits. She made them at 3 o'clock in the morning in the middle of a blizzard in a house with no power on a gas stove for 5 strangers she had not known existed 12 hours ago. She used the last of her flour. She used the last of her sugar. She used the last of the buttermilk. When the biscuits came out of the oven golden and warm, she set them on a plate and covered them with a clean dish towel and set the plate on the counter for morning. She did not sit down again. She stood in the kitchen for a while looking out the window at the snow, which had finally begun to slow. She thought about her brother. She thought about Arnett. She thought about the strange way the world had brought 5 men to her door on the worst night of the year, and one of them had carried her brother's name with him for 60 years without knowing it. She made a fresh pot of coffee with the last of the grounds. She sat down at the kitchen table. She watched the candle in the window burn down until the sky outside began very slowly to turn from black to gray. The first thing the men smelled when they woke up was coffee. The second thing they smelled was biscuits. They woke up one by one, stiff, sore, blinking in the gray morning light that filtered through the plastic-covered windows. Brock was the first one up. He sat up on the couch and his bandaged arm hurt, and he sat there for a moment looking around trying to remember where he was. Then he remembered. Then he smelled the biscuits. 5 massive men crammed around a kitchen table built for 2, elbows touching, knees against the wall, eating biscuits with strawberry preserves Mavis had canned herself the previous summer, drinking weak coffee out of mismatched mugs like it was the best meal of their lives. Because right then it was. Brock ate 3. Knox closed his eyes on his first bite and shook his head slowly. Wyatt just kept eating one biscuit after another like a man making up for something. Hollis said very quietly, "Ma'am, these are the best biscuits I've ever had in my life. And I'm from the South." Mavis smiled. She stood by the stove with her arms folded, watching them eat her own untouched biscuit on a plate beside her on the counter. When they finished, Sutton pushed back from the table. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest, which had dried overnight on the kitchen chair. He pulled out a thick fold of cash. Hundreds mostly. Probably $1,500, maybe more. He set it on the kitchen table between them. Ma'am, he said, this is for everything you did last night. Please take it. Mavis looked at the money. She did not touch it. She pushed it back across the table slowly with 2 fingers. Not angry, not insulted, just clear. Put that away, she said. I didn't help you for money. I helped you because you needed help. That's the beginning and the end of it. The room got quiet. Sutton stared at her. His eyes got wet just for a second. He blinked it away the way a man does when he hasn't cried in front of anyone in a long time. He nodded. He put the money back. Then he did something none of his men expected. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest again. He pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. Dark brown, gold-edged pages. The kind of book a man carries when his life is run by appointments and decisions. Not a napkin. Not a piece of scratch paper. A real notebook. Can I have your name, ma'am? He said. She told him, Mavis Holloway. He wrote it down, careful, deliberate. He asked for her address. She laughed, the first real laugh anyone had heard from her since they had arrived. Honey, she said, you don't owe me a thing. Just in case I want to send a thank you, he said. She gave him the address. He wrote it down. He closed the notebook. He slipped it back into his vest. Before they left, the men did things she didn't ask them to do. Knox and Wyatt cleared the snow off her porch steps and her walkway using a shovel they found in the garage and their own gloved hands. Hollis salted the path with rock salt from the bag by the back door, the bag Arnett had bought the year before he died, and that Mavis had been making last in the years since. Brock, with his bandaged arm, did what he could from the porch holding the screen door open. And Wyatt, the quiet one, the one who had not said 3 words since he arrived, the one whose feet she had warmed in her own hands, found her old screen door hinge, the one that had been sticking for 2 years, and he fixed it with a multi-tool from his pocket. He didn't ask, he just did it. When he was done, he stood up and looked at the door and said, there, that'll hold. Then he walked off the porch without another word. Sutton was the last one out. He stopped at the doorway. He turned. He looked at Mavis, who was standing in the entryway in her sweater and her slippers, with one hand on the doorframe. He said, ma'am, I'm not going to forget last night. She nodded. You take care of yourselves, she said. All of you. You hear me? Brock was already on the porch. He turned around. He came back. He took her hand in his, bandaged one awkwardly, and he squeezed it, and he said, you remind me of my grandma. Mavis patted his arm. You call your mama when you get home, she said. You hear me? He nodded. He couldn't speak. He walked out. She stood in the doorway and watched them go. 5 figures in black leather walking down Maple Hollow Road through 2 feet of fresh snow, getting smaller and smaller until the road curved and they disappeared. She went back inside. She closed the door. She sat down at the kitchen table. She finished her coffee alone. For about 2 weeks, nothing happened, and Mavis figured that was the end of the story. She was wrong. Life went back to normal. The pipes survived the cold snap. The roof still leaked. The buckets went back in the upstairs hallway. The kerosene heater kept running. Same routine. Same quiet days. She told the Pritchard kids about the bikers over after-school peanut butter sandwiches. Their eyes went wide. She laughed about it. 5 big old boys sleeping on my floor, she said. Arnett would have had a fit. The kids asked her if she was scared. She thought about it for a second. No, she said, they were just cold. That was the story, a good story for the kitchen table, nothing more. Then strange things started happening. First, a delivery from the hardware store downtown. 2 kerosene heater refills dropped off right on her porch, already paid for. Mavis didn't order them. She called the store. The clerk said someone had phoned it in, paid with a credit card over the phone, wouldn't leave a name, had given her exact address. Must be a mistake, Mavis said. No, ma'am, the clerk said. They were very specific. She let it go. Figured maybe it was someone from church being generous, even though she hadn't been to that church in 3 years. A week later, a truck pulled up on Maple Hollow Road. White truck. Logo on the side that said Brookhaven Roofing. 2 men in work clothes knocked on her door and told her they had been contracted to do a courtesy inspection on her roof. Mavis stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. Contracted by who? The foreman checked his clipboard, flipped a page, ran his finger along a line. Client is listed as Ravenel Holdings, he said. Mavis frowned. Never heard of them. That's all I got, ma'am. They just want us to take a look. No charge to you. She was suspicious, but the roof was leaking. Had been leaking for almost a year. So she let them up. They took photographs, they measured, they made notes, they thanked her, and they left. That evening, Mavis mentioned it to Darlene over the fence. Ravenel Holdings, Darlene said. She thought about it. That sounds like one of those big corporations. There's a Ravenel logo on a couple of trucks I see going up the highway. Big company. Columbus, I think. Mavis waved it off. Probably some kind of scam, she said. But something nagged at her that night. She went to the kitchen. She looked at the wobbly table leg. She bent down. She pulled out the old magazine she had been using to prop it up. She held it up. She looked at the cover for the first time in months. America's Most Unconventional CEOs. A row of small portrait photographs along the bottom. Faces she didn't recognize. Names she had never heard. She stared at it for a moment. Something flickered at the edge of her mind. Something she couldn't quite reach. She shook her head. She put the magazine back under the table leg. She went to bed. She did not yet know what was coming. 3 days later, the envelope arrived. It was hand-delivered. No stamp, no return address. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, the kind that comes from law offices, the kind Mavis had only ever held in her hand once or twice in her life. She opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a single sheet of paper on the letterhead of a law firm out of Columbus, Ohio. 2 paragraphs, short, professional. The first paragraph informed her that her medical debt of $2,200 at Brookhaven Memorial Hospital had been paid in full. A receipt was enclosed. The second paragraph informed her that a granite headstone had been commissioned for the grave of Mr. Arnett Holloway at the Brookhaven Cemetery and had already been installed. Mavis read the second paragraph 3 times. She set the letter down on the kitchen table. She put both hands flat on the table on either side of it. She did not move for a long time. Then she stood up. She walked to the closet. She put on her coat, her thickest one, the heavy gray one Arnett had bought her in 2011. She put on her boots. She wrapped a scarf around her neck. She pulled her wool hat down over her ears. She walked out the front door, down the porch steps, down Maple Hollow Road, past Darlene's house, and the Pritchard's house, and the empty lot at the end of the block. She walked the 8 blocks to the Brookhaven Cemetery in the cold. She walked through the gate. She walked past the old section, past the rows of weathered stones, past the place where her own mom and daddy were buried side by side. She walked to the section near the back where Arnett's grave was. She had not been there in 3 months because the cold was hard on her hip. She rounded the corner of the last row and she stopped. The wooden cross was gone. In its place stood a headstone, granite, polished, dark gray with flecks of black and silver, the kind of stone that stands for 100 years and doesn't weather. Carved into the face of it in clean, deep letters, Arnett Holloway, 1948 to 2014, beloved husband, builder of homes and hearts. Mavis sank down into the snow. She put both her hands on the stone. The cold of the granite came through her gloves. She did not feel it. She bent forward until her forehead touched the top of the stone. She wept. She wept in a way she had not wept in 11 years. Not the quiet tears she had let fall in front of Sutton the night of the storm. Not the careful, contained grief she had carried since Arnett died. This was something else. This was the sound of a woman who had been holding her breath for 11 years, finally letting it out. She knelt there in the snow for a long time. When she finally stood up, her knees were stiff and her cheeks were wet and her hands were going numb in her gloves, and she looked at the stone one more time and she said very quietly, "They finally gave you your stone, baby. I'm sorry it took so long." She walked home through the snow. When she got back to the house, she did something she had not done in years. She climbed up on a chair in the kitchen slowly because her hips still bothered her in the cold, and she pulled down the small tin box from the top of the cabinet behind the cookbooks she never used. She set it on the kitchen table. She sat down in front of it. She opened the lid. The folded bills were still there. Singles, fives, a few tens, $120, $312, 11 years of saving. The money she had hidden from her own self because looking at it had hurt for so long. She counted it slowly, one bill at a time, the way she had counted it on nights when nobody was watching. $312. The money she had saved for a headstone that had already been bought. She sat at the kitchen table with the tin box in front of her and she thought about it for a long time. She thought about Arnett. She thought about what he would have said. She thought about her brother. She thought about her mama and daddy lying in the cemetery a few rows over from where Arnett's new stone now stood. She thought about the Pritchard kids and their sandwiches and the cold January nights when she had eaten a piece of toast for dinner so she could send a Tupperware home with their mother. By the time evening came, she knew what she wanted to do with the money. She did not know yet who had bought the stone. She did not know it had not been Sutton. She would find out the next morning. But the money in the tin box, the money she had carried as a quiet shame for 11 years, had finally found its purpose. She closed the lid of the tin box. She did not put it back on top of the cabinet. She set it in the middle of the kitchen table where she could see it. She went to bed early. The next morning at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday, a black Cadillac Escalade with tinted windows pulled up onto Maple Hollow Road, and everything Mavis Holloway thought she knew about the night of the blizzard was about to change again. It was a Tuesday just after 10 in the morning. Mavis was washing dishes at the kitchen sink when she heard it. An engine, low and heavy, not the kind of engine you heard on Maple Hollow Road, not a pickup truck, not the mailman's little white van. Something bigger, something that didn't belong. She looked out the window. A black Cadillac Escalade with tinted windows was parked at the curb in front of her house. Brand new by the look of it. Chrome wheels, the kind of finish that catches the light even in February. The neighbors noticed. Darlene came out onto her front porch in her housecoat, holding a coffee cup, staring. The woman across the street pulled back her curtain. 2 doors down, old Mr. Riley stopped shoveling and leaned on his shovel. A vehicle like that on Maple Hollow Road meant something. It was never good news. 2 men in dark suits stepped out of the back seats. They stood by the car, hands folded in front of them, sunglasses on, even in the gray February light, the way men stand when they are paid to stand that way. Then the front passenger door opened. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, silver hair cut short, wearing a tailored charcoal overcoat and polished black shoes that had not been within 100 miles of a Brookhaven sidewalk in years. Mavis did not recognize him, not at first. He looked like he had just walked off the cover of a business magazine. And in a way he had. He walked up her porch steps. The same steps he had climbed 3 weeks earlier, caked in ice bleeding through the toes of his boots with frost in his beard. This time his shoes were dry. His back was straight, his face was calm. He knocked, 2 knocks, gentle this time. Mavis dried her hands on her apron. She walked to the door. She opened it. She looked at him, she looked at the Escalade. She looked at the men in suits standing by the car. Then she looked back at his face. Something clicked. The eyes. She would have known those eyes anywhere. She had spent half the night looking at them across her kitchen table. "Well, I'll be," she said slowly. "The biker." Sutton smiled. A real smile, not the careful one a man in a suit puts on for strangers. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He stood there in her doorway, the same doorway where he had stood half-frozen 3 weeks ago, and he introduced himself properly. His full name was Sutton Ravenel. He was the founder and chief executive officer of Ravenel Industries, a logistics and infrastructure company based in Columbus. He had started it at 29 years old in a rented warehouse with 2 employees and a used truck. 27 years later, the company was worth around $2.8 billion and employed roughly 4,000 people across 6 states. Sutton Ravenel was one of the most powerful businessmen in Ohio, and 3 weeks earlier he had been freezing to death on Mavis Holloway's porch. Mavis put her hand on the doorframe to steady herself. She looked at the Escalade again, then at the suits, then at Sutton. "You're telling me you're some kind of CEO?" "I am, ma'am, but that night I was just a man who was freezing to death. And you saved my life. All 5 of us." Mavis nodded slowly. Her mind was working through everything that had happened in the past 3 weeks. The kerosene refills, the roofing crew from Ravenel Holdings, the envelope from the law firm, the headstone. She looked at him. "You all come on in," she said. She held the door open. He turned to his security men. "I'll be a while," he said. "Stay with the car." He walked into her house. He stopped in the entryway. He looked around the living room, the same room where he had eaten chicken soup 3 weeks ago, where he had sat in Arnett's recliner with the hunting coat over his shoulders, where he had picked up a photograph of a 17-year-old boy off the rug and learned the name of someone his mother had remembered for 60 years. The room looked different in the daylight, smaller somehow. The buckets were still in the upstairs hallway. The plastic was still on the windows. The kerosene heater was still in the corner humming away. But Mavis took his coat. She hung it carefully on the hook by the door. She led him into the kitchen. He sat down at the kitchen table. The same table, the same chair, the same spot where he had eaten her biscuits at 6 in the morning 3 weeks ago. He noticed the small tin box sitting in the middle of the table. He did not ask. She poured him a cup of coffee. She poured one for herself. She sat down across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mavis said, "The headstone." Sutton looked up. "I went to the cemetery," she said. "I saw it. I want to thank you." He shook his head slowly. "Ma'am," he said, "I have to tell you something." She waited. "The headstone wasn't me." She blinked. "Beg your pardon." Sutton set his coffee cup down. "I paid the medical bill," he said. "The hospital. That was me. The boys at the company found out about it for me and we took care of it." He took a breath. "The headstone was the boys." Mavis stared at him. "What boys?" "My boys," he said. "Brock, Knox, Wyatt, Hollis, the 4 men who slept on your floor." Mavis put both hands around her coffee cup. "After the ride," Sutton said. "After we got home, after we all warmed up and figured out we were going to live, we got together at the clubhouse. Brock had questions. He had seen the photograph in the living room, the one on the mantle, the one of the cemetery with the wooden cross. He couldn't get it out of his head." Sutton went on. He went online. He looked up the cemetery in Brookhaven. He looked up your husband's grave. He confirmed what he thought he had seen. Mavis's hand tightened on the cup. He came to me, Sutton said. He told me what he had figured out. And he said, boss, that woman gave us everything she had, and her husband doesn't have a stone. Sutton looked at her. I told him I'd take care of it. He said no. He said it had to be us, not the company, the men who had slept in her house. He wanted to pay for it himself. Sutton smiled just a little. Brock makes about $42,000 a year working at an auto body shop in Buffalo. He doesn't have an extra $2,000 lying around. Neither do the others. But they got together. They put in what they could. 2 weeks of pay each of them. Brock put in 3. They covered the stone, the engraving, the installation, and the maintenance fee for the next 10 years. He looked at her. It wasn't me, ma'am, it was them. Mavis did not say anything for a long time. She looked down at her coffee. She looked up at the kitchen window where the plastic sheeting was peeling at the corner again. She looked at the photograph of Arnett on the wall above the table, the small one in the silver frame. She put her hand over her mouth. She did not cry. She had cried at the cemetery. She had emptied something at the cemetery that she had been carrying for 11 years, and there was nothing left to cry just then. But her shoulders shook once, and she sat very still until they stopped. Then she said very quietly, those boys. Sutton nodded. Yes, ma'am. Those big old boys? He nodded again. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She picked up her coffee. She took a sip. She set it down. Well, she said, all right. She looked at him. All right. So if you didn't do the stone, then what are you here for? Sutton smiled. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a folder. He set it on the kitchen table between them. Ma'am, he said, I've been thinking about that night every single day since. He took a breath. I've sat in boardrooms with people who had every advantage in the world. Money, power, resources. Most of them wouldn't have opened that door. You had every reason not to. Every single reason. I know what your brother went through. I know what you saw when you looked at us through that curtain. He looked at her. You opened the door anyway. Mavis did not speak. My mother taught me something, Sutton said. She said, when someone opens a door that should have been closed, you spend the rest of your life keeping it open for others. He let the words sit. I'm not here to pay you back. You made it very clear how you feel about that. I'm here to keep a door open. He opened the folder. I'd like to walk you through some things, ma'am. I need you to hear all of it before you say a word. Can you do that for me? She folded her hands in her lap. She nodded once. He turned to the first page. First, this house. Ravenel Industries is going to renovate your home top to bottom. New roof, new furnace, full electrical and plumbing update, new insulation in the walls, every window replaced. Mavis opened her mouth. Sutton held up a hand. I'm not finished. We are not tearing anything down. Arnett built that back porch. We are not touching it. We are fixing everything around it, but the porch stays exactly the way it is. Mavis's eyes filled. She pressed her lips together. Her chin trembled just barely. She did not speak. He turned to the next page. Second, I noticed something about you the night of the storm, Mrs. Holloway. You feed people. That's who you are. You made soup for 5 strangers out of almost nothing. You watch those Pritchard kids 3 days a week. Mr. Pritchard told me, by the way. He found me when he heard I'd been by. He went on. 2 blocks from here, there's a vacant storefront. Used to be Brookhaven Hardware. It's been sitting empty for 3 years. Mavis knew the building. She walked past it every time she went to the corner store. Dusty windows, faded sign, weeds growing through the cracks in the sidewalk out front. The Ravenel Foundation is going to buy that building. We're going to convert it into a community kitchen and meal program. Full commercial kitchen, tables for 40, open 5 days a week, free meals for anyone who walks in, no questions asked. He looked at her. I want you to run it. Head of operations, paid position with benefits. You'll have a staff of 5 all hired from this neighborhood. The foundation will cover everything for the first 3 years. After that, we transition to a sustainable model with local partnerships. Mavis stared at him. Her mouth was slightly open. No words came out. He turned to the next page. Third, this street, Maple Hollow Road, cracked sidewalks, no street lights at the south end. That empty lot at the end of the block where the kids play in the road because there's nowhere else. He went on. The foundation is committing a $500,000 block grant for this neighborhood. Sidewalk repair, new street lights, a playground at the end of the block on that empty lot. The grant will be managed by a community board made up of people who live on this street. I would like you to chair it. Mavis was gripping the edge of the kitchen table now. Her knuckles were pale. He turned to the final page. Fourth, this one is personal. He set his pen down on the table. The foundation is establishing 2 annual college scholarships, $15,000 each, awarded every year to Brookhaven High School seniors who demonstrate exceptional community service. The first scholarships will be awarded this spring. He let the words land. They'll be called the Arnett and Mavis Holloway Scholarships. That was when Mavis broke. Not dramatically. Not the way people break in movies. She did not scream. She did not fall out of her chair. She just went very, very still. And then the tears came slow and quiet rolling down her cheeks, one after another. The kind of tears that come from a place so deep you didn't even know it was there. The tears of a woman who had held everything together. Every bill, every leak, every cold night, every empty chair at the table for 11 years alone without asking anyone for anything. And someone had finally seen her. Sutton did not speak. He sat there. He gave her the room. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the kerosene heater and the slow tick of the wall clock above the stove. After a long moment, Mavis wiped her face with the back of her hand. She took a breath. She steadied herself. She looked at him. She said no. Sutton blinked. She said it again, quieter this time, but clearer. No, not the way you said it, not all of it. He did not move. He waited. Mavis put her hands flat on the table. The house, she said. Yes, Arnett would want the roof fixed. He would want a furnace that worked. He would want the porch left alone, so yes. She nodded once. The block grant. Yes, these kids need a place to play. Mrs. Pritchard needs a sidewalk that doesn't crack her ankles. The street needs lights, yes. She drew a breath. The scholarships, yes. She looked at him. But not in our names. Sutton tilted his head. In whose name, ma'am? Mavis took a breath. Put my brother's name on them. Ezekiel Holloway. He died in 1965 in Mobile, Alabama. He was 17 years old. He never got to go to college. He never got to drive that Chevy. He never got to do anything. She went on. Nobody has said his name out loud in 60 years. Your mother said it once on a page in a folder she couldn't get published. You said it once in this kitchen 3 weeks ago. That's it. She looked at him. Put his name on the scholarships. Let some black boy or girl in Brookhaven who deserves a chance go to college with my brother's name on their application. Let that be the thing that brings him into the world again. Sutton was very still. He nodded slowly. We will do that, he said. Then Mavis took another breath. And the kitchen, the food program. Sutton waited. Don't put my name on that either. Don't put Arnett's, put Zeke's. She looked at him. Call it the Ezekiel Holloway Memorial Kitchen. Put a sign over the door that says, when he was born and when he died. Put a sentence under it that says, say his name. Don't make it about me. Don't make it about my husband. Make it about my brother. She held the cup tighter. He was a boy who used to put his hand on the top of my head when we walked anywhere together. He was a boy with a laugh you could hear from 3 houses down. He was going to take me for a ride in his Chevy. He died in a yard in Alabama, and the world forgot him. Let Brookhaven remember him. She looked at Sutton, and her eyes were clear and steady and old. Let the kids who eat in that kitchen know his name. Let them ask who he was. Let somebody tell them what happened to him. Let his name go back out into the world. Sutton's eyes were wet. He did not bother to hide it this time. He nodded. We will do exactly that, he said quietly. Mavis nodded. She reached across the table. She took his hand, her small hand on top of his big one. Then we have a deal, she said. She held his hand a moment longer. There is one more thing. He waited. Mavis pulled her hand back. She placed it on the tin box in the middle of the table, the one she had set there the night before. She slid the box across the table to him. She opened the lid. Inside the folded bills, $312, she said. Singles and fives mostly. A few tens, 120, 11 years of saving. She looked at him. I had been putting this aside for a headstone. The boys took care of that for me. So I want this money to go into the kitchen. The first $312 of meals served. Free, from me, for my brother. I want this to be the first money that kitchen ever spends. Sutton looked at the box. He looked at her. He did not reach for the money right away. When he finally did, he picked it up the way a man picks up something fragile. We will mark it on the books, ma'am, he said. We will mark exactly where it came from and exactly what it was for. Mavis nodded. For the first time in that conversation, she smiled. Really smiled. The kind of smile that changes the whole shape of a face. The kind that comes from somewhere so real it almost hurts to look at. Sutton smiled back. Outside, the February sun hit the snow on Maple Hollow Road, and the whole street lit up white. 3 months later, construction crews showed up on Maple Hollow Road. Trucks, scaffolding, workers in hard hats carrying lumber up Mavis's front steps. The roof came off first, the old one patched and leaking and held together with prayer and plastic buckets. Gone. replaced with new shingles and new flashing and new gutters that did not sag at the corners. Then the furnace, a real one, installed in the basement. For the first time in over a year, Mavis turned a thermostat dial and felt warm air come through the vents. She stood over the vent in the hallway for 5 minutes. She didn't move. She just stood there with her eyes closed and her hands held out in front of her, feeling the heat on her palms. New windows went in, double-paned. No more plastic sheeting. No more tape peeling off in the middle of the night. Electrical, plumbing, insulation in the walls. A new water heater, a new front door that actually closed all the way. And the back porch, Arnett's porch, stayed exactly where it was. They worked around it just like Sutton had promised. Mavis sat on that porch the morning after the renovation was finished. Coffee in hand, no coat needed because the house was warm now and the morning sun was strong enough to take the edge off. She looked out at the small backyard. She looked at the maple trees that gave the street its name. She said very quietly, "We got a new roof, baby." She said it to nobody in particular. The cats heard her. Bishop and Deacon were sitting in the sunny spot at the end of the porch dozing. She said it again. "We got a new roof, and the porch is still here." 6 months after the night of the storm, the Ezekiel Holloway Memorial Kitchen opened its doors. The old Brookhaven hardware storefront, dusty windows, and faded sign and weeds in the sidewalk was gone. In its place stood something alive. Fresh paint, warm lighting, tables for 40, a commercial kitchen with steel counters, and a 6-burner stove that made Mavis's eyes go wide the first time she saw it. A sign hung above the front door, hand-painted, simple, clean letters on a deep green background. The Ezekiel Holloway Memorial Kitchen, and underneath in smaller letters, "In memory of Ezekiel Holloway, 1948 to 1965, Mobile, Alabama. Say his name." Inside on the wall behind the cash register framed under glass was a small piece of paper, a handwritten note, Mavis's own handwriting. It read, "The first $312 of meals served from this kitchen were paid for by Mavis Holloway in memory of her brother. May they be the seed of every meal that comes after." Mavis stood under that sign on opening day. She was wearing an apron and a hairnet, the same kind she had worn at the school cafeteria for 28 years. The apron had her name on it. Underneath her name, it said Head of Operations. She told everyone she was just warming things up. She was there at 6 in the morning on opening day. She made the first pot of coffee. She put the first pan of biscuits in the oven. She unlocked the front door at 7. 200 people came through that first day. Single mothers from the east side who hadn't sat down for a meal in weeks. Elderly folks who hadn't eaten with company in months. Teenagers who came in after school because it was warm and because somebody actually asked how their day was. 3 of the Pritchard kids who came in with their mother and sat at a table in the back and ate biscuits with strawberry preserves and told everyone who would listen that Miss Mavis had taught their mama how to make these biscuits when she was little. The local news showed up, a camera crew, a reporter from Channel 9 out of Columbus. The reporter asked Mavis how it felt. She thought about it for a second. "It feels like Tuesday," she said. "We're just feeding people." The story aired that night. It ran for 4 minutes during the 6 o'clock broadcast. The reporter went out of his way to read the sign on the wall slowly so the camera could catch it. The Ezekiel Holloway Memorial Kitchen. Say his name. The phone started ringing the next morning. People wanted to know who Ezekiel Holloway was. The kitchen had been ready for that. Mavis had asked Sutton to put together a small wall display just inside the front door with the black and white photograph and a paragraph telling the story of a 17-year-old boy who had been killed in Mobile, Alabama in June of 1965 and whose murder had never been investigated. People stopped and read it. Every day. They stood in front of that wall and they read the paragraph and they looked at the photograph and they said his name out loud in a small, forgotten town in Ohio 60 years after he died. 2 blocks away, the empty lot at the end of Maple Hollow Road became a playground. Small but perfect. A swing set, a climbing wall, rubber surfacing so the kids wouldn't scrape their knees when they fell. The Pritchard kids were the first ones on it, running and screaming and laughing so loud you could hear them all the way down to Mavis's porch. Darlene organized a Saturday morning porch and play. Parents sat on their stoops. They watched the kids. They talked to each other. Something that hadn't happened on that street in years. New streetlights went up on the south end of Maple Hollow. The sidewalks got repaired slab by slab until you could walk from one end of the road to the other without watching for cracks. For the first time in a long time, Maple Hollow Road looked like a place where people wanted to be. Spring came. The first 2 Ezekiel Holloway scholarships were announced at the Brookhaven High School Senior Assembly. One went to a girl named Tamira Davis, who wanted to study nursing and become the first person in her family to graduate from college. The other went to a boy named Wesley Moore, who planned to study civil engineering and who said in his application essay that he wanted to come back and build things in towns like Brookhaven. Mavis presented the awards. She stood at the podium in the high school auditorium. She was a small woman, silver-haired. Her hands were shaking just a little. She looked at those two kids and she looked at the auditorium full of seniors and parents and teachers, and she took a breath. "This scholarship is named for my brother," she said. His name was Ezekiel Holloway. He was 17 years old when he died. He never got to be in a room like this. He never got to wear a cap and a gown. He never got to drive a car. He never got to grow up. She let the silence settle a moment. For 60 years, nobody said his name out loud. And then 5 strangers walked into my house in a storm, and one of them was the son of a woman who had tried 60 years ago to write my brother's name down on a page. She looked at Tamira. She looked at Wesley. "Your job," she said, "isn't to pay this back. Your job is to pass it on." The auditorium was silent. Then it was not. The applause went on for almost 3 minutes. People stood up. Parents who had no children in the running stood up. Teachers who had taught at that high school for 30 years stood up. The principal stood up. Sutton, sitting in the 3rd row with his security detail several rows behind him, stood up. Mavis stepped down from the podium and walked back to her seat, and Sutton took her hand for a second as she passed his row, and then he let go. A week after the scholarship ceremony, Sutton came back to Brookhaven with a car. Not the Escalade. A small black sedan driven by one of his men. He picked Mavis up at her house at 9 in the morning, and he drove her to the airport in Columbus. "Where are we going?" she asked when he had told her 2 days earlier to pack an overnight bag. "Atlanta," he had said. He had not told her why. They flew on a small private plane Mavis had not known existed. She had never been on an airplane before. She held the armrest with both hands during takeoff. Sutton sat across from her, and he smiled at her and he said, "You're doing great, ma'am." In Atlanta, a car met them at the airport. They drove to a small assisted living facility on the edge of the city, the kind with brick walls and a circular driveway and flowers planted in the front beds even in early spring. Sutton walked Mavis through the front door. He led her down a hallway. He stopped at the second to last door on the right. He knocked. "Mama," he said, "it's me. I brought somebody." The door opened. A small white woman stood in the doorway. 88 years old, silver hair, a face that had been beautiful once and was still in a way that has nothing to do with smooth skin. Sharp eyes, a small smile that was already there before she even saw who was at the door. She looked at Mavis. Mavis looked at her. Neither of them spoke. Then the white woman put both hands over her mouth. "You came," she said. Mavis nodded. The white woman, Eleanor Ravenel, who had been a journalist in Birmingham in 1965 and had been fired in October of that year for refusing to drop a series of articles she had reported on, who had carried a manila folder in a file cabinet for 60 years, who had raised her son to remember debts that had never been paid, stepped forward and took Mavis Holloway's hand in both of her own. "Mrs. Holloway," she said, "I have been waiting 60 years to meet you." Mavis squeezed her hand. "I'm sorry it took so long," she said. Eleanor shook her head. Her eyes were wet. So were Mavis's. "Come in," Eleanor said. "Come in, I have something to show you." She led them into a small sitting room with 2 armchairs and a coffee table, and a window that looked out onto a courtyard with a fountain. On the coffee table was a manila folder. Old, battered, edges soft from being handled too many times. Eleanor sat down. She motioned for Mavis to sit across from her. Sutton took the chair by the window. Eleanor opened the folder. Inside was a stack of typed pages, yellowed with age. Carbon copies, the kind of pages that came out of a 1965 typewriter. She lifted out one set of pages. She handed them to Mavis. "This is what I wrote," she said, "about your brother. They wouldn't publish it. I kept it." Mavis took the pages. Her hands were shaking. She read. It was an article, 3 pages long. It described in careful and unflinching detail the events of a Saturday evening in June of 1965 in Mobile, Alabama. It named the gas station. It named the white woman at the pump. It named the white men in the pickup truck, though Eleanor had only been able to confirm 3 of them. It described Ezekiel Holloway. It quoted his father. It quoted his mother. It quoted his sister. Mavis stopped reading. She looked up. "You interviewed my mama and daddy." "I did," Eleanor said. "You interviewed me." "I did." "I don't remember." "You were 12 years old," Eleanor said gently. "You wouldn't come out of the back bedroom. Your mother asked me to come sit with you. I sat on the edge of the bed and you told me about your brother. You told me he was going to buy a Chevy. You told me he was going to take you for a ride in it." Mavis put her hand over her mouth. "I told you that." "You told me everything," Eleanor said. "And then I went home and I wrote it down and I tried to put it in the paper and they would not let me." She let the silence sit. But I never threw it away. I want you to know that. I never threw any of it away. Mavis nodded slowly. She set the pages down on the coffee table. She reached for Eleanor's hand. Then Eleanor reached into the manila folder again. She pulled out a smaller envelope faded at the edges and held it across the coffee table to Mavis. There is something else, she said. I want you to have this. Mavis opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, larger than the one she kept in her Bible, sharper, professionally taken. It was Zeke, standing on the porch of the small house on the dirt road in Mobile. He was wearing a clean white shirt and a tie. He was holding a baseball glove in one hand. He was smiling at the camera, the wide, easy smile of a boy who had no idea what the next month was going to bring. Mavis put her hand over her mouth. I brought a photographer with me the day I came to interview your family, Eleanor said. He took this on the porch before we started. I never had the chance to give it to your mother. She passed before I could find her again, and after that, I did not know how to reach you. Mavis touched the photograph with one finger. Her hand was shaking. I have never seen him in this picture, she said. I have only ever had the baseball uniform. Now you have both, Eleanor said. Mavis nodded. She could not speak. She slipped the photograph carefully back into the envelope. She held it against her chest. Thank you, she whispered. The two women sat there for a long time, an old black woman and an old white woman holding hands across a coffee table in Atlanta 60 years after a boy died in a yard in Mobile, Alabama. Eleanor said very quietly, I am going to publish this. With your permission. I have a small press in Atlanta that wants the whole folder. 10 articles. The story of 10 boys. I want your brother's article to be the first one. Mavis nodded. Yes, she said, publish it, tell his story. Eleanor squeezed her hand. And I want the dedication, she said, to be to you, to Mavis Holloway, who opened her door. Mavis shook her head. Dedicate it to my brother, she said. Dedicate it to all 10 of them. We were just the ones who lived. Eleanor nodded slowly. All right, she said. That evening, Sutton flew Mavis home to Brookhaven. She slept most of the flight. When the plane landed, she woke up and she looked out the window at the lights of Columbus. And she thought about her brother, and she thought about Arnett, and she thought about the strange way a life can turn at the very end when you had stopped expecting it to turn at all. The bikers came back too. Sutton, Brock, Knox, Wyatt, Hollis, all of them. They rode in on a clear Saturday morning in late April for the kitchen's opening weekend leather cuts on beards trimmed 11 months from the night of the storm now, and looking like men who had carried something with them ever since. They sat at a table in the back of the kitchen. Mavis served them herself. Soup, the same recipe from that night. Brock took a spoonful and grinned with the side of his mouth that didn't have a biscuit in it. Still better than my mom's, he said. Knox brought his daughter. She was almost 6 years old now, blonde curls. She climbed into Mavis's lap during dessert and put her small hand on Mavis's cheek and said, Are you my new grandma? Mavis laughed. She laughed so hard she had to put her napkin over her face. Honey, she said when she could speak again, I would be proud to be your new grandma. Brock brought his own mother. She had come down from Pennsylvania by bus. She and Mavis hugged in the doorway of the kitchen, two women who had never met, both of them with grown sons standing behind them. Both of them with their hands on each other's shoulders, and Brock's mother said, He told me what you did. He told me. I have been wanting to meet you for a year. Mavis hugged her again. He's a good boy, she said. He calls you on Sundays, doesn't he? Brock's mother nodded. 4 o'clock, she said. That's a good boy, Mavis said. A Columbus television station picked the story up again. Then a regional newspaper. Then it went wider. It got shared online. People wrote about it. The Ravenel Foundation announced an initiative called Open Door Day, an annual event where their employees volunteered at community kitchens and shelters across Ohio. Inspired, the press release said by one woman one night, one open door. Mavis hated the attention. I didn't do it for cameras, she told Darlene one evening on the porch with the sun going down behind the maple trees. Darlene smiled. She knew Mavis as well as anybody. I know, she said. That's exactly why they're here. The summer after the kitchen opened, Mavis did something she had not done in 59 years. She went back to Mobile, Alabama. Sutton drove her. Just the two of them. A small black sedan, 11 hours on the road with stops for coffee and for Mavis to stretch her hip. She had not asked him to come with her. He had asked her if he could. She had said yes. They crossed the Ohio River early in the morning. They drove south through Kentucky and Tennessee. Mavis watched the country go by out the window. She did not say much for the first 6 hours. Sutton did not push. He drove. He let her be. Around noon, they stopped at a small diner outside Nashville. Mavis ate a grilled cheese and drank a glass of iced tea. She looked at Sutton across the booth and she said, I never thought I would see this part of the country again. What stopped you? He asked. She thought about it. Fear, she said. And then time. And then the fear became habit, and the time became too much to make up. Sutton nodded. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, he said. We can turn around. Right here, we can go home. Mavis shook her head. He's been waiting 60 years, she said. I'm not going to make him wait any longer. They drove on. They reached Mobile late that afternoon. Mavis directed Sutton from memory. Down Government Street. Past the shipyard, which was smaller now, mostly closed. Past the gas station, which was a different gas station, now owned by different people, but standing on the same corner where her brother had been walking the night the pickup truck came around. Mavis looked at it for a long moment. She did not say anything. Sutton did not stop. They drove out to the colored cemetery on the edge of town. It was smaller than she remembered. The grass was overgrown in some places. Some of the stones had fallen over, but the cemetery was still there. Somebody somewhere down the years had been keeping it. Not well, but enough. Mavis walked the rows slowly. She had not been here since she was 12 years old. She did not know if she would remember where the grave was. She remembered. A small plot near the back. A wooden cross, the paint long worn away the wood gray and split with age. The cross was leaning to one side. The dates were no longer readable. The name was no longer readable. But she knew. Mavis knelt down. She put her hand on the wood. I'm here, Zeke, she said. I came back. I'm sorry it took so long. She knelt there for a long time. Sutton stood at the edge of the row. He did not come closer. He gave her the space. When she finally stood up, her knees stiff, her hips sore, she turned to him. He needs a stone too, she said. Sutton nodded. He does. 3 months later, a granite headstone was installed in that plot. Polished. Dark gray with flecks of black and silver, matching the one in Brookhaven where Arnett lay. Carved into the face of it in clean, deep letters, Ezekiel Holloway, 1948 to 1965. Beloved brother, say his name. Mavis did not go back to Mobile for the installation. She did not need to, but she carried 2 photographs of the stones in her purse from that day forward. The one in Brookhaven, where Arnett lay with the maple trees behind it. The one in Mobile, where her brother lay with the long grass blowing in the Gulf wind. Folded next to the photograph of Zeke on the porch that Eleanor had given her. The 3 of them together side by side, the way a husband, a brother, and a sister should be. Sometimes when she sat on her own back porch in the evenings, she would take the photographs out of her purse and look at them. Just look at them. Bishop and Deacon would sit by her feet. The maple trees would rustle. The Pritchard kids would yell something from down the block. And Mavis Holloway, 72 years old, would say her brother's name out loud in the warm summer air, on her own porch in her own house, in a town that had finally learned to say it with her. A year passed. February came back around to Brookhaven, Ohio. On the 14th of February, almost exactly 1 year to the day after the storm, the forecast called for another blizzard. Not as bad as the year before, the weather service said, but cold, heavy snow, the kind of night that empties the streets and locks the doors. But one door stayed open. The Ezekiel Holloway Memorial Kitchen. Lights on, heat running, soup on the stove. Mavis kept it open late that night. She didn't have to. Nobody asked her to. The volunteers had all gone home at 6 like they did every weekday. The kitchen normally closed at 7. She just looked at the weather report that afternoon and she said, somebody might need a warm place tonight. So she stayed. She made a double batch of soup. She stacked blankets by the front door. She put a fresh pot of coffee on. She wiped down the tables. She turned every light on inside the kitchen so the building glowed from the street so anyone walking by would know it was open. It was quiet. A few of the regulars came through early. They ate. They thanked her. They went home before the snow got bad. By 9 in the evening, Mavis was alone. She stood at the counter wiping a bowl that was already clean, listening to the wind outside, watching the snow whip past the front windows. Then at 9:15, a knock on the door. Almost the exact same time, almost the exact same sound. 1 year to the night. Mavis set the bowl down. She walked to the door. She opened it. A young woman stood on the front step. Mid-20s, white, shivering so hard she could barely stand. She was holding a toddler against her chest, wrapped in a thin blanket. The child's cheeks were red from the cold. The young woman's lips were the color of ash. My car broke down, she said. Her voice was barely there. On the highway. We walked. I don't know how far. I saw the light. She started to cry. Not from sadness, from relief. Mavis did not hesitate, not for 1 second. Same voice, same words, 1 year later. Well, get in here, she said, before you freeze to death. She reached out. She took the child gently from the young woman's arms. The toddler whimpered, then quieted as soon as the warm air of the kitchen hit his face. Mavis carried him to a chair by the heating vent. She unwrapped the thin blanket. She wrapped him in a thick, clean one from the stack she had piled by the door that afternoon. She turned back to the young woman who was standing in the entryway, shaking, looking around at the kitchen, at the lights, at the sign on the wall. "Come on, baby," Mavis said. "Come sit down. I've got soup." She heated up 2 bowls. She poured a cup of coffee. She called a tow truck on the kitchen phone. She called a motel 1 town over and got the young woman a room for the night. She paid for it out of the kitchen's emergency fund. Then she sat down across from the young woman. She let her cry. She let her breathe. She let her get warm. The young woman looked at Mavis through wet eyes. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked. Mavis smiled, soft, steady. "Somebody knocked on my door once too," she said. "This is just what we do here." The young woman wiped her face. She looked up at the wall, at the photograph of a 17-year-old boy in a baseball uniform, his cap pushed back on his head, smiling at a camera in Mobile, Alabama in the summer of 1965. "Who is that?" she asked. Mavis looked at the photograph. "That's my brother," she said. "His name was Ezekiel Holloway. Let me tell you about him." Outside, the snow kept falling. The wind pushed against the windows. The sign above the door glowed in the storm. Inside, warm light, warm soup, 2 women at a table, a sleeping child by the heater, a photograph on the wall of a boy who had not been forgotten. Mavis picked up the ladle. She poured 2 more bowls. She sat back down across from the young woman, and she started very quietly to tell the story. One open door. That was all it ever took. One door opened in the worst storm of the year by a 72-year-old black grandmother who had every reason in the world to keep it closed. One door and a name spoken out loud after 60 years of silence. One door in a town that started feeding its own again. One door and a brother brought home from Mobile, Alabama. One door and a young woman on a winter night and a child asleep by a heating vent, and the story being passed on to the next pair of hands. Mavis Holloway will tell you, if you ask her, that she did not do anything special, that she just opened the door, that anybody would have done the same. But anybody didn't. She did. And somewhere tonight, on a quiet street in a forgotten town, there is a door that has been closed too long. Maybe it's yours. Maybe it's the one across the hall. Maybe it's the one you walked past this morning without looking up. The storm is always coming. Somebody is always cold. The only question that ever matters is whether you will open the door when they knock. Mavis Holloway opened hers. Now you know her brother's name.